I thought I would take a brief moment to talk a little bit about international water resource cooperation, linking together the topic for today, international responses to human security and environmental change, as well as link it back to our earlier discussion on water resources, because I know that, and water conflict, because I know that a lot of students in this class, because of where you live within Australia or because your pre-existing interests, there's a lot of interest on water resources, and I thought it'd be interesting to spend a little bit of time to look at the balance between opportunities for cooperation and conflict across international shared resources. So we've seen how water can be a source of potential conflict, both between different groups within countries or spanning boundaries, like in the Omo and Turkana regions of Ethiopia and Kenya, as well as cross nationally with Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan. But I think it's also indicative of this one area being scarcity, providing incentives for cooperation instead of just conflict. That you have countries that are often at conflict, like India and Pakistan, can nevertheless come together and reach agreements for cooperation of this kind of shared resource. And I think in doing so, I wanted to highlight an additional data source that we hadn't really looked at before, but that if you're curious, you can spend more time looking at. The Oregon State scholars have created a database called Transboundary Waters that can allow you to explore these disputes and cooperative agreements around the world. And you can see the number of different countries that can share a common resource can vary. Most of these river basins are through three countries, however defined over time. Um, all the way through 17 with the Danube, or 11 with the Congo River and the Niger River. And so you can have as we mentioned earlier, the larger number of actors involved, the more difficult it can be to reach any kind of concrete agreement either way. But you can also see that these agreements and basins can stretch across a large number of different countries. Using these data and looking at one of the articles that was generated using these Oregon State dispute data, that you can see that in blue, those are the cooperative agreements, and the yellowish orange as hostility efforts, that you can have 0 cases of formal acts of war. You can have hostile or military acts, people rattling sabers or taking your boat into the other's territorial waters. But by and large, it's limited to talk. Verbal hostility or support are the most common acts related to water basins, and these non-military agreements are hugely outnumbering the number of hostile acts in these areas. And so you have an interesting take about a specific resource that is often discussed as being the most susceptible to scarcity in a number of regions around the world, but by and large there's an increased cooperation. And so you can make different arguments depending on what shared river basin you're talking about, but given the shared humanity or shared interest in the particular area, it's often possible to separate issue areas in which you have similarities and overlap, and those that you can have a dispute. I think of the relationship between China and the U.S. being a clear one, in which you have areas of conflict, but then also clear areas for cooperation. And there's countless examples, even in outright war, in which you have other areas in which the conflicted actors are still cooperating. Often in areas of functional nature, like water, it makes me think of the earliest international cooperative agreements for sending mail or for airplane routes around the world, that these kind of functional agreements are in everyone's interest and are less seen as politicized, but as a matter of mutual benefit, that there isn't these kind of hostile acts, which I thought was interesting. And so you see the distribution of the types of conflict and cooperative areas for agreement, and you see quantity is what matters with a lot of these water disputes and agreements. In the Water Week, we saw in Central Asia, the source of agreement was not just about quantity, but when it was actually released. But I think that would, in this classification, go into water quantity, right? Because you had the upstream sources wanting to keep the water in the winter for hydroelectric dams so they could use electricity during the winter, while the downstream countries wanted more water in the summer so that they could water their crops. And so those kind of discussions about water quantity would be ones that are ongoing issues. Also be the ones related with the Nile as well. But you also see similar overlap between the different topics for dams, canals, and water quality as well. Be interested to look at the water quality issues because you have examples of pollution in some of the water basins that I've looked at and seen whether there's any kind of agreements about how to kind of limit that pollution would be quite difficult given economic and political considerations in the polluting states. Be interested to look at. So yeah, that was kind of a brief hand wave at international water cooperation, a positive note showing that even in something that is becoming increasingly scarce and increasing cooperation, it is still in contention. It's still an area by and large of cooperation, though as with human security and conflict, it is an open question about whether cooperation will continue in the future once things get really bad. Really looking forward to the new Dune to kind of see how they deal with the scarcity of water and just it's never going to come out and we're never going to see movies again. Anyway, so lecture question number 2. Why do you think cooperation is more common than conflict over shared freshwater resources? And what differences do you see between cooperating over freshwater and saltwater resources? So I think I'd be interested first in your one take for why cooperation trumps conflict in this area. Are there any lessons for any other areas that we've looked at so far this semester? You can think of natural resources, human migration, or other issues that could benefit from cooperation. And how can we differ between different forms of water? Because we're going to see in the Arctic discussion in a second that there is a difference in the extent to which cooperation has been hammered out and the transparency and the extent to which it covers resources is quite different in fresh as opposed to saltwater resources. So why do you think, what are those kind of differences that we're going to see in the links between those two? So take a minute, answer that in Waddle, and then we'll finally get through to the international responses to a changing Arctic. I think this is one of the more interesting and important areas of the world that are being that have seen increasing changes over time, and an area in which you've seen increasing attention paid by a lot of the world's major powers. So yeah, let's answer the lecture question 2, and then we'll come back to the Arctic and watch the videos, the background videos on the Arctic before we get into the discussion. Thank you.